Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much for joining. Maybe we will give another 30 seconds to see if there are more people getting in, and then we can start. Okay, I think we should begin now, and if there are more participants, will join us in due course. So, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Aarti Khosla. For those of us who have not met with each other, I coordinate the work of a global communications network in India. It's called the GSCC, and I also run climate trends. I also have my colleagues Madhulika and Josefa on the call here today. Uh, as you know, there have been a lot of discussions, especially in the last couple of months, on the troubles with the power sector. And one of the big troubles really has been the distribution sector. 2 years back, nobody had literally imagined that the DISCOMs will be in such bad shape and they will have the level of bad debts which are going in the range of 16 to 17 billion dollars. But clearly, the power sector in India, despite all the reforms and the policies which move towards renewables, are at a place where the transition possibly needs to be accelerated further. And rather than coming from the top, it feels that there is a lot of momentum that is happening at the level of individual states, which are seeing merit in not installing any further coal and looking at options of meeting their additional power demand through renewables and what it means to transition towards a power system which is less energy intensive, emission intensive, but at the same time look for cleaner pathways of growing. And for us, and the way that we have coordinated with partners like IEEFA, LUT, now also cuts, it's become pretty clear that this momentum is really coming from the ground up. Gujarat and Chhattisgarh were one of the earlier states last year in September which announced that they will not do any further coal. Then at the COP, which is the Conference of Parties meeting in Madrid, there was a report called Winds of Change, which was released, which essentially looked at how renewables are pretty unstoppable in the Indian context, and there is, a lot of option for states like Rajasthan, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, Gujarat, and others to literally announce a no new coal policy. And as COVID, assailed the world, one of the unintended consequences was the drop in power demand when we had other states like Tamil Nadu even saying that we need to reassess our coal pipeline. And a month back, literally, we had a similar gathering for the state of Maharashtra, where Kashish and his colleagues presented what is needed in Maharashtra at the level of the distribution companies and the recommendations over there. And very pleasantly, we saw that the energy minister of Maharashtra, a couple of days later, actually made a statement that the state does not need any further coal and could do with renewables combined with storage. And I'm only giving this kind of background, so that all of us can be in that context that talking about energy transition and what it means for Rajasthan is not an isolated case, but we are seeing more and more of a bottom-up kind of an approach where rather than a United Nations Secretary General statement uh, wielding the magic wand, so to say, on no new coal. It's the economic uncompetitiveness of a thermal power plant as opposed to setting up renewables, which is actually taking precedence at the level of states, and states are seeing all of the merits of putting up renewables. It comes with its own pinch of salt, and which is why we thought that, especially for a state like Rajasthan, which has one of the largest solar potentials, but there has to be a planned transition. And pretty much nowhere in the world that planned transition has been seen. Otherwise, we would have had a precedence to follow. But possibly bringing some viewpoints out at this webinar, we wanted to come out of it wiser in terms of what it will mean for the state of Rajasthan as it stops thermal, builds renewables, but should be done in a way that it takes care of the value of just transition in letter and spirit, which means that even large renewables are deployed in a way in which land rights and ownership issues are resolved before you go ahead and put up large, massive solar parks, which eventually should not do the same damage that started claiming was done by thermal. In any case, I will just introduce the panel in a bit, and that will give you the range of topics that we would want to cover. But essentially, this is the flow of the discussion today. I see there are some journalists who are present here, so just for your benefit, you're free. It's a small conversation. You're free to type your comments in the chat box. Also, feel free to raise your hand as you have a question and the presenter is presenting. But other than that, we will record this call like always. We will share the recording with you. If you have to quote somebody, you are free to do so. And speakers also, please note that your statements will be on record. If you don't want that, then please let me or Josefa know. But either way, if somebody is filing a story, I request you to please play it back with the expert before you go ahead and file. And with that, I just wanted to introduce our panel to you formally once, and also in the speaking order. We first have Kashish Shah, who's a researcher at IEEFA, and as you all know, IEEFA has been doing a lot of research and examining the economics of the power sector, and Kashish will present findings of the report that IEEFA recently has done on the distribution sector and its recommendations. We then have Manish, who is from the University of Lappeenranta in Finland. And Manish and his team have actually done quite a path-breaking modeling looking up to 2050 on what it means for the entire northern grid of India to turn 100% renewable. And apart from the fact that it will have huge environmental benefits, they've also calculated benefits in terms of costs and benefit in terms of a lot of jobs, like 5 million jobs, and I will let Manish talk about it. But Manish will talk about how the state of Rajasthan fits in the modeling and what it means for the state to just turn the table around and look at its ability to export energy as opposed to what it is right now. We then have Sarthak Shukla, who's a researcher at Community Consumer Unity and Trust Society called CUTS International. It's a think tank from Rajasthan, and they will talk about the analysis that they have done on energy transition and the vision that CUTS International supports for the state of Rajasthan. And our last speaker, and not the least, but to wind up this discussion in bringing the very important perspective of how the whole issue of energy transition should be made just, and how big solar should not spell big trouble. We have from the Center for Policy Research, Senior Fellow Manju Menon, who has joined us. And Manju will tread that line between how the shift to renewables and clean energy is essential, but how it should also factor in some of the other very valid concerns of communities and their rights over the land, and how that should be dealt with. I know we are covering a lot of ground, but at this moment, therefore, I will pause. I will also request you to stay muted if you don't have anything to say at the moment. And we will go with the speaking order. We will first have Kashish, and I give the floor to you, Kashish. I will say that, let me just say that you have about 8 to 10 minutes for opening remarks, and then we can have a discussion when everybody has got time to speak.
Sure, Aarti. Thanks for that introduction. Just want to quickly check, am I audible?
Yes.
Sure. So let me just share my screen so that I have a small presentation. So hopefully everyone's able to see the presentation now.
Yeah.
All right. I'll just begin briefly by introducing the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis, briefly abbreviated as IEEFA. So we are an energy finance think tank with a mission to accelerate the global transition of the energy such that the low cost, low emission renewable energy sources of power generation could contribute to a profitable energy economy. Now, today I'm going to, as Ati said, I'm going to talk about some of the key findings and conclusions of my recently released report on Rajasthan. At IEEFA, we see Rajasthan's renewable energy sector as an immense opportunity to power a green recovery from this economic downturn that we are seeing. Rajasthan arguably is India's best solar state, and the success of 2.25 gigawatts of Badla solar power park, which managed to record lowest tariffs in India at one point, is actually the proof of the argument that Rajasthan is the best solar state in India. Now, my report discusses some of the key issues of the Rajasthan's generation as well as power distribution sector. And I also have modeled, Rajasthan's supply side for the next decade, which can transform Rajasthan's electricity sector. So I'll quickly begin by talking about what does Rajasthan's electricity sector look like at the end of FY 2019 and 20. So as you can see, there is at the moment good balance between coal-fired capacity as well as renewables. So at the end of March 2020, coal formed 45% of Rajasthan's power generation capacity and 56% of the total generation, whereas renewables were 44% of the capacity, but only 18% of the generation. Now, one key issue that we need to talk about is the low utilization rate of Rajasthan's coal-fired capacity. This actually reflects the stress of coal-fired power sector, not just in India, but all across the globe. And owing to this underutilization of its massive capacity, we estimate that Rajasthan had to import 10.9 terawatt hours of electricity during the last year, which is 13.5% of its total demand last year, which is quite a significant number. Now, let's look at the renewable energy capacity. So Rajasthan at the end of March 2020 had 5.2 gigawatts of solar capacity and 4.3 gigawatts of wind capacity. And as I said, Rajasthan is the best solar state in India, and the commissioning of 1.7 gigawatts during the last year, which was more than any other state in India, ahead of Karnataka and Tamil Nadu, which commissioned 1.4 and 1.3 gigawatts of renewable energy, solar capacity last year. Now, looking at the overall potential, Rajasthan has massive opportunity in terms of deploying solar capacity. National Electricity Plan of 2018 suggests that Rajasthan has 142 gigawatts of solar power potential, which means right now Rajasthan's just utilizing less than 5% of its total solar potential. And on the wind side as well, there is 18.7 gigawatt of overall potential, which is again only a quarter of it, less than a quarter of it is being utilized. So I will talk about another huge opportunity for Rajasthan's wind sector in my as we talk further in the presentation. Now let's look at some of the coal-fired power tariffs. So in this table, I have 9.3 gigawatts of Rajasthan's coal-fired capacity tariffs. So if you could if I could draw your attention to the pointer in the rightmost column, you can see the tariffs in Rajasthan for the coal-fired projects are all above rupees 4. And for some, and if you see the breakdown between capacity charges and the variable charges, you could see that some of the power plants like Kota and Suratgarh have variable charges of more than 3 rupees at 3.1 and 3.6 kilowatt hours, which is 30 to 50% higher than the lowest tariff India recorded during the last SECI auction of 2 gigawatts at rupees 2.36 per kilowatt hour. Now, let's look at the impact of these high tariffs, which of the coal-fired power plants, which are massively underutilized. So we look in this chart, we look at the two key metrics for the DISCOM performance. So AT&C losses and ACS ARR gap. So as you can see, in the given period between 2015 and 2020, which also overlaps with Uday's regime, you could see that ACS and ARR gap depicted by the orange line had a promising start, where the DISCOMs in the first couple of years could reach a profitable position, but then onwards it's gone backwards, and now they face a massive ACS and ARR gap of 1.16 rupees per kilowatt hour. For AT&C losses, the state has made progress from an unsustainable AT&C losses of 31% to now at 22.5% registered during the last year. Although this is progress, but it's nowhere near to the target of 15%, which was assumed under Uday. Now we've tried to analyze why Rajasthan's facing such a huge ACS and ARR gap. So the three key issues that I analyzed was, one, that Rajasthan doesn't have any substantial in-state coal mining, which incurs massive coal transportation cost of hauling coal from distances of 600 to 1200 kilometers, in the range of 600 to 1200 kilometers from other states. Also, it doesn't have the advantage of availability of cheaper hydropower. So that also burdens the DISCOMs with buying expensive power. Also, during peak power, during the peak hours, Rajasthan faces an energy deficit. So it relies on either importing power from other states or buying power from the open market. And when they actually have surplus power during the off-peak hours, they actually do not get equivalent tariffs for their overcapacity during non-peak hours. Also, there has been no tariff hike since last 5 years, which sort of pushes Rajasthan's cost of power purchase high, and at the same time, it doesn't allow them to recover its power purchase costs. Owing to these reasons and the underperformance, Rajasthan's DISCOMs booked a loss of nearly $1 billion, which is somewhere around rupees 6,355 crore. Now, we've spoken about the current issues that Rajasthan's facing, and as I said, we have modeled a transformation pathway for Rajasthan's electricity sector over the coming decade. So even though there are quite a few numbers in this slide, but if you could look at my pointer and look at the electricity production trend and demand trend which I've projected for the coming decade, based on Rajasthan's GDP growth and its electricity demand growth over the last decade. So I think Rajasthan's economy is doing fairly well, and it's growing at 6.7%. It grew at 6.7% during the last decade. So I estimate a net demand growth of roughly 5.5% over the coming decade. But you will notice that the production requirement to actually meet this demand is growing at a lesser rate, which is at 4.2%. Now, how do Rajasthan achieve this target? Two key steps: reducing AT&C losses and improving energy efficiency. So in my model, I've accounted for an annual reduction of 1% in AT&C losses. So if Rajasthan is able to achieve, let's say, AT&C losses reduction of 1% annually and reach a level of 12.5% by 2029-30, this is possible. In terms of energy efficiency, I haven't really seen any significant progress on energy efficiency until now. So I've been a bit conservative on accounting for energy efficiency over the coming decade, only at 0.05%, which is really immaterial in the context of such a large electricity market. But there is a massive room for Rajasthan government to actually improve on this side. Moving on, again, talking about energy efficiency and energy intensity of Rajasthan's economic growth. So this chart has contribution of various sectors into Rajasthan's economy. And if you could focus on the red on the orange bars, that depicts the service sector in Rajasthan, and that is the fastest growing sector in Rajasthan between the given period in the chart. So the service sector's contribution has grown 9% between these years. So now, as you know, service sector is less energy intensive than any of the sectors such as manufacturing or any other industrial sectors. So the increasing share of the service sector in Rajasthan's GDP implies a decreasing energy intensity. In other words, you require lower units of electricity to generate an additional dollar value of GDP, which is a good news for Rajasthan's electricity sector. Moving on. So as I said, transformation. In this slide, you can see a splash of green, which is the growth of potential growth of renewable energy capacity in Rajasthan. So according to my model, given the demand and the production requirement, and given state's potential, I model what would Rajasthan's electricity sector look at the end of the next decade. So coal would form 21% of the capacity and only 28% of the total electricity demand, whereas renewables will form 73% of the total capacity and 63% of the total generation. Now, in terms of renewable energy capacity, I have estimated a new addition of 22.6 gigawatt of new renewable energy capacity, of which 18 gigawatt will be solar. And talking about utility scale versus distributed, for at the moment, given the project pipeline of renewables in Rajasthan, there is roughly, I think, 5 to 6 gigawatt of utility scale solar that is under development in Rajasthan. So I'm not a solar engineer, I'm a finance analyst. So I look at things from an investment perspective, I look at things from a low cost energy perspective, but I do understand that utility scale solar would have challenges for the grid expansion and the grid balancing side. So I would leave it up to the experts to actually find the right balance between the utility scale solar and distributed solar. Again, on the wind side, as I said, there is a massive opportunity of wind repowering. So when I analyze Rajasthan's wind power fleet, roughly more than 60% of its wind power capacity was commissioned before 2010. Now, over the last decade, the wind turbine technology has grown immensely. The costs have come down, and the sizes of the turbine has also increased. So if Rajasthan is able to actually repower some of its old wind power farms, there is a massive opportunity to actually optimize Rajasthan's wind power potential. So I estimate another 4 gigawatts of wind power commissioning over the coming decade, either through repowering or through new builds. Now let's look at what's happening on the coal-fired project pipeline side. So the pipeline in terms of coal doesn't look too expansive in Rajasthan at the moment. So there are only 1.2 gigawatts of coal-fired projects which are in the planning stage, and there is only 0.7 gigawatt of capacity that's actually under construction right now. But you also have some of the fleet there. An aging fleet in Rajasthan. So I identified two coal-fired power plants which form 1.4 gigawatt of capacity and which will reach its end of life by 29-30. So as I said, these power plants have massive sunk cost for DISCOMs. The overall tariffs is way higher than what will be available in terms of solar over the coming decade, as solar takes a deflationary path. So even with net 0.7 gigawatt of addition and 1.4 gigawatts of coal-fired power retirements, you have negative 0.7 gigawatt of additions over the coming decade. And even with that, the utilization rates from an already unsustainably position of 55%, it will collapse to 41% by 29-30. Now, again, looking at what is going to happen with the profile of the incremental demand, what will be serving Rajasthan's incremental demand. So according to my model, the utility scale solar, rooftop solar and wind power potential will actually serve more than 100% of its incremental demand. Now, how is that possible? It's possible because the low cost wind and solar will actually take away some market share from the coal fired power sector. So my model sees negative 43% of market share loss for coal fired projects in Rajasthan. Now, quickly wrapping up by answering why Rajasthan should transition its electricity sector. It has massive opportunity to attract investment in renewable energy generation infrastructure as well as related transmission infrastructure. Also, as I said, Rajasthan is still reliant on import of power from other states or buying expensive power from open market. So if Rajasthan is able to utilize its renewable energy potential, there is a potential to actually export renewable energy and earn some extra revenue for the DISCOMs. And as I said, the low cost, low emission renewable energy sources could potentially get DISCOMs to actually operate sustainably with a profitable position. Now, on my last slide, some of the issues that we could discuss on this panel, and then which it could be taken forward for the policymakers. So number one is the retirement of its old coal-fired power plants. Number two is there have been reports of imposition of certain land tax for renewable energy projects, which the developers are not really happy about. Number three is solarization of agricultural demand, which could see DISCOM reduce its burden of cross subsidies, and also in order to reduce its AT and C losses, Rajasthan could see digitalizing its operations through smart meters. So just to conclude, I think if Rajasthan has massive potential in terms of getting bringing investments into its renewable energy sector, and if the government stays on track, we're pretty confident that Rajasthan could be a model for other states for renewable energy transition. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kashish, for spelling out the entire energy economics in a way, and also the last 4 points that you made. I mean, some of the things that you spoke about, how in the next 10 years net coal phase out will be pretty much of a natural progression. And I think then the question is how to accelerate that transition. And clearly, the signals and sentiments are all pointing towards renewables, but even what is a better way to do renewables, how much of that is large, how much of that can be decentralized, all those. And I think we will come to it. But for the moment, maybe that's a good way to also bring Manish Ram, a researcher at Lappeenranta University of Finland. Manish, do you want to talk about the work that you have done and kind of expand also from where, Kashish mentions a lot about the state, but from the little that I know from your paper, that also talks about the interrelationship of the states in the northern region, and I guess that could be also a model to follow as we go beyond 2030 and into like mid-century and net zero pathways for a lot of countries, including India. But I'll leave to you to explain more on your work.
Yeah, well, thanks, Aarti, and I think it's a nice presentation by Kashish too. So, I mean, I hope I'm quite clear on the audio.
Yes, fully.
Okay. So, yeah, I have a small presentation too, and maybe we can just jump into that, and we'll see. Take it from there, I guess. Okay. So, is the presentation okay?
Yeah. Yeah. You want to go full screen?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, then. So, yeah, so it's sort of a brief background that I think we've been working with climate trends to sort of look at the entire northern grid, as Aarti just mentioned. And yeah, I'll have to say that our modeling was a lot more complex and a lot more comprehensive in a way. So we are a team based out of Finland and Lappeenranta University. And it's quite a global team. And we've been doing sort of energy transition analysis pretty much across the world. And then we've been working with different partners around the world to see how energy transition, or the energy system transition, as we call it, sort of moves ahead in the sort of years to come, and also from a perspective of 2050. So we always try to have the Paris Agreement as a vision, and then try to model the system of trying to meet those goals, and how different aspects of the system can come together, and what are the different economics around it. So I'll sort of take you through it. So when we started looking at this whole region, I mean, we knew that there are quite a lot of issues already going on in India, and also especially in North India, with the air pollution issue and the high costs of electricity, especially if you look at Delhi and some of the cities there where the electricity prices kind of keep increasing. And we also heard of the whole water crisis due to, you know, the expansion of thermal power, and most of the summer seasons where the drought comes in and creates a lot of complications and leads to conflicts with irrigation, water for irrigation, and farmers are in always bigger trouble. So we thought an energy transition could obviously try to answer most of these issues. And as we sort of went in to do the analysis, we also were struck with this pandemic. And I think also the coming out of the pandemic, and the most of the talk around how we recover, or the economic recovery from the pandemic happens, is also going to be driven by a lot of energy transitions around the world. And even India is in a good position to take advantage of that and sort of push forward. So one of the key elements that we also thought was how jobs can be created in the future, and how the energy transition can help create these jobs, and where the jobs could come from. So we looked at the region, as we said, and we thought about seeing how we can sort of model the entire energy system, not just the power system. So as we are these days talking about electrification being a trend, and a lot of the additional demand that is entering into the power system, so it's not any more feasible just to model the power sector as it is today, and try to sort of say that the demand is not going to be impacted by a lot of the infusion of electric vehicles, a lot of electric heating or electric cooling, and also a lot of industrial processes adopting electricity as a means. And as some of you might have already recently heard of the stories, that when the steel production is switching away from going from coal towards green hydrogen, which is again uses renewable electricity to generate the hydrogen and then manufacture the steel, and so on and so forth. So they will see the trend that would create a lot of electricity demand in the future, and the sectors, the different sectors sort of coming together, and like what it is generally called as sector coupling, which is a trend which is already taking shape in Europe and also in North America, and most of these areas where the different sectors are coming together, and sort of they also complement each other in a way as we sort of move ahead. So right now, yeah, pretty much it's clear, I think, just as Kashish also said, a lot of coal, a lot of gas, but in the recent years, a little bit of renewables is taking shape. But comparatively, North India has been a bit of a laggard, I would say, compared to some of the Western states and the Southern states. And there's a lot of potential for especially states like Rajasthan, Uttar Pradesh to catch up and sort of install a lot of renewables into the system. So this is just a brief outlay of how we do our work, and we sort of accumulate all the data, and then we set it up into the model. And one of the key aspects of the model is that we also try to simulate prosumers, or like what you would say decentralized solar, rooftop solar in most cases. So what we try to do is try to analyze it from the consumer's perspective as to how they can reduce their costs and when it becomes attractive for them to start putting up solar or their own power production, and then how that can impact the entire energy system and how they sort of come into the entire sector. So in a way, we also have analysis on an hourly basis, and also we try to do analysis from a geospatial resolution of about 50 kilometers each. So our modeling is, I'll have to tell you, is quite comprehensive. And that also creates a lot of challenges for us, and it's extremely time consuming. So this is another aspect where we sort of show the different technologies that go into the system. So we not only cover the power system, but also try to cover the whole aspects of balancing and where storage comes into play as a key technology, because as we increase the shares of renewables, and as Kashish mentioned that, yeah, we need a lot of elements to balance this renewables, and because we know that the sun is not always shining and the wind is not always blowing, so we need different aspects. So we have various flexibility mechanisms and also sector coupling topics like the power to gas, and we have batteries, and we have the sort of gas storage, which can also play a key role in providing seasonal storage, especially in the monsoon time when we have less of solar and less of wind across most states of the country. So there it's very critical to then understand the system in a more comprehensive manner. So we also modeled the transport sector, which is extremely important as we go ahead. And most states in the country are coming up with EV policies. And I think Delhi's recent EV policy is, I think, the most ambitious one. And Rajasthan probably still doesn't have one. So I think that is something where Rajasthan might soon be catching up, because as we know, the economics are slowly tilting in favor of electric vehicles, and it will not be surprising to see a lot of infusion of electric vehicles in the system. And then we'll have questions about how the rest of the transport system can be then taken on the green path, as we say. So one of the key elements, what I wanted to highlight here was that as we are talking of hydrogen these days becoming a key element into the entire energy sector. So we've sort of included this entire hydrogen, and along with hydrogen, the entire synthetic fuels that will sort of come into play in the years to come. Maybe around 2030, 2035 is the timeline where we're seeing the costs of synthetic fuels start really competing with fossil fuels, and especially for a country like India that's importing most of its fuel from at a pretty high cost, and which is also a burden for us. I think this is a strategy that we have to start adopting towards thinking of how we can produce our fuels in-house, and then we could sort of save the huge import bill, which is sort of creating a challenge. So this slide kind of highlights how the kind of energy demand across the region sort of shapes out. So what happens is, yeah, we have the different sectors, and then the different sectors have their demands, and we try to see how much electrification happens across these sectors and how much of it sort of then leads to the final energy demand. So we've sort of tried to understand this by the graph on the right side, where it shows that if we sort of consider the growth as it is today, without any electrification, the demand goes up to almost 9,000 terawatt hours by 2050. But due to a higher electrification rate, we would reduce this demand to almost 55,000, which is a massive decline, and which sort of highlights the real efficiency and the economic benefits that electrification brings in. Which is not sort of surprising, because most of the industries realize this already, and a lot of them are shifting towards adopting higher use of electricity. And as renewables are becoming lower cost, then low cost electricity will be the next energy carrier of the future. So this slide sort of tries to highlight that, and we sort of see that electricity will be the mainstay, and electrification up to almost 95% of all the sectors could be expected by 2050. Yeah, here we just sort of show the PV and the solar PV and the wind potential across the region. And as Wind Kashish mentioned, I mean, Rajasthan has a fantastic potential for solar almost all across the state. And it also has some amount of wind in the southwestern part. Wind is a bit more tricky in India because, as we also know, the wind potential is predominantly in the south and west, and I mean along the Western Ghats. So we see like most of the wind would be probably installed in these states like Gujarat, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, even some parts of Andhra. So I think to do a more comprehensive modeling, we'll have to consider the entire country and then see how that sort of balances the whole system. Because right now, due to the consideration of just the northern grid, we see that solar emerges to be a lot more prominent. And also due to the cost competitiveness, solar is sort of beating wind these days, and it will probably be the prime source. And that's exactly what happens in our modeling as we try to map out the electricity generation and heat generation through the transition period. So let's say we start at 2020, which is heavily coal-based, and we move towards 2050, which then sort of is completely transformed towards a more PV-based system. So this PV-based system obviously will entail a lot of other changes in the energy sector. Like we sort of, I said, it will also need a lot of the heat to come from different sources, and the heat mainly would start coming from heat pumps and electric heating and some amount of biomass. And most of the heat is for industrial purposes, as we generally don't have a huge domestic heating market, or we don't have a lot of residential heating that is taken up. But some parts of the North India, obviously heating is still key. So this is something which is kind of new to a lot of the energy models that are out there, as due to the reason that we do an hourly analysis, that also enables us to look at the system from a perspective of how it needs to be balanced for the entire year on an hourly basis. And this kind of allows us to understand what sort of storage technologies and what sort of flexibility mechanisms would be required in the system. And therefore, we are able to see that batteries obviously play a key role. And then we see that generally from 2030, they start kicking in and really play a major role by 2050. And as we are also seeing that the costs are coming down drastically, and it's kind of following the similar pathway of PV, solar PV, which was pretty much the last decade. And we see that batteries will become one of the key technologies then to complement the power system and also the energy system. And obviously, once we have a lot of electric vehicles, you also have batteries, battery-driven electric vehicles, which will then also be sort of interacting with the grid and then providing services as generally the fleet ownership are already talking about providing these services to the DISCOMs. So we would sort of see a new element there where the vehicle to grid concept comes into play, and that really changes the entire dynamics of the system. And similarly, we also see there's a bit of a demand for gas in the storage system, because gas obviously plays a key role in providing the seasonal storage. So as the monsoon comes into play in the Indian context, we need some amount of storage that is generally power converted into gas, and which is stored during these months and then utilized in the hours when we need the electricity. And another interesting aspect is we sort of map out how the entire transport system, moves away from using fossil fuels towards using a lot of electricity. And then there are different aspects of the transport system that come into play, where hydrogen comes into play, and then synthetic fuels are also adopted. So we've kind of mapped this, and I'm sure the presentation will be up and you can go through the numbers. And the next important part is obviously the cost, because the costs are critical, and we see that the levelized costs of electricity, at least from a perspective where we see at the regional average costs are close to about 70 euros per megawatt hour, or close to about 3,900 rupees for a megawatt hour. And that has the potential to come down to at least 2,900 by 2050. And obviously, which will require a lot of investments to go in. And so where we try to map out the capital investments, and we see that there's a lot of investments that go into the different aspects of the energy system. So obviously, which will be taken over by solar, batteries, a bit of wind, and a bit of synthetic fuels there coming in. So all these aspects would definitely lead to a lot of economic benefits, and how we sort of show that. So the emissions obviously will come down drastically, and especially in the power sector, where we see a more rapid decline. And then the other two sectors, which is the heat and power sector, will follow pretty close. And yeah, hopefully we get there by 2050, and we'll have a net zero emissions sector then. Yeah, and this is one of the key findings, as Aarti was also mentioning. We found out that the jobs would increase quite significantly, and will reach up to from 3 million right now to up to 5 million jobs can be created across the different aspects of the energy sector. And another interesting aspect is that a lot of operation and maintenance jobs would be created, which are a lot more stabler jobs. Because yeah, we would move away from jobs which are predominantly in the fuel sector, in the coal mining, or even handling of different fuels, towards a lot more operation and maintenance, which are probably much better quality jobs, and these will really be able to transform a lot of people's lives, and also provide much better economic stimulus to the whole region. Yeah, another key aspect is that we did sort of also try to understand how the electricity flows through the region, and which states emerge as being the major exporters. And obviously states like Delhi, which would rely a lot on imports, they would rely on these neighboring states such as Rajasthan, UP, and even some of the northern states for their demand. And we see that Rajasthan definitely has a role to play there. And I sort of tried to dig out some numbers exclusively for Rajasthan. So which is quite clear that the system charts transitioning towards a lot more solar. And by 2050, we see almost a 95% solar-based system. And that is a kind of a massive shift from what it is today. And this will definitely bring into play the export potential for Rajasthan, because the costs would drop so significantly, as we saw that Rajasthan has the potential to bring down costs the most of all the states in the northern grid. And that will lead to a potential where they can be the main exporter to most of the neighboring states. And that allows them an additional impetus to boost the economy and create more jobs in the state. And that's a finding which I think is very kind of important, and hopefully is interesting to some of the policymakers. And as I was telling you, the levelized cost of electricity it comes down by almost 60%. So we see that it's close to about 70, 80 euros right now, and it comes down to close to 30, which shows the potential that almost 95% solar-based system can definitely bring down costs. And then it has a lot of impetus for the state, and that again can also bring down a lot of other aspects of pollution and also all this stuff. So this is just summarizing all the major highlights of our findings, and I'm sure I don't have to go through all of them again, but I think some of the key messages are definitely that this is technically possible and economically viable. And also the state of Rajasthan has a lot of potential to not only power itself, but also then become an export hub and help some of the neighboring states to also transition towards higher shares of renewables. And that can definitely benefit all of the country too. And obviously the entire northern region, we see a lot of jobs there. So that should be a great incentive that we do need jobs in the short run, and hopefully once we sort of have policies that sort of take up the energy transition more aggressively, we could create a lot more jobs, and that would sort of boost the economy in the short run and also sustain it in the long run. And yeah, you can sort of read more about the report, and we have the link to the summary, and hopefully, yeah, if there are questions, we can then take it up and also look forward to a good discussion around these things.
Thank you very much, Manish. This was extremely comprehensive and fairly technical in the middle, but as you said, it's technically viable and economically feasible. And the question is mainly of political will and how to make that happen. But I think we've had two very good presentations so far with all the analysis that IEEFA has done on the energy finance side, and clearly your study just doesn't deal with the power sector, but you also talk about electrification of transport, which is another major chunk, and I think which eventually states have to come to. But maybe for the purposes of this discussion, we will limit ourselves to the power sector and take it one by one. But may I move to you, Sarthak, to talk a little bit about what your analysis is and what is your assessment being based in Rajasthan? How do you feel the political economy of the power sector is looking? Feel free to take your 8 to 10 minutes.
Thank you. Am I audible, Aarti?
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Aarti. And also thank you, Kashish and Manish, for sharing those insightful findings. And I hope to borrow and pick up some of the points that they mentioned as we proceed. I don't have a presentation with me, but what I'll do is I'll try to summarize my findings and take you through the research that we have done in the form of a story using some critical metrics and data points that we have gathered here. Before beginning, a quick introduction about CUTS. So we are a Jaipur-based global public policy think tank. We have centers in Calcutta and Delhi, and rural centers in different districts of Rajasthan, as well as presence abroad in Africa, Geneva, and USA. So we usually, we have different centers that kind of do research. The one in which power sector work is being taken is called the Center for Competition and Economic Regulation. And we have done quite a bit work in engaging with grassroots organizations and consumers in the power sector. We run 3 consumer assistance cells. So I can, I think I'll give you a flavor of what the ground realities are also here. here, sorry. And just coming to the main point, both the speakers have very, very rightfully mentioned that power has largely been seen as a techno-economic sector only. And but I submit to you that it has deep linkages with the society, with the environment, and the politics part of it as well. So when we talk about devising solutions for the current problems that this sector faces, there's a need to also address this cross-sectoral systemic, if I may use the word, linkages with different other parties that are involved in this sector. Now, coming to the Rajasthan and the story that I want to tell, both the speakers have said that it's a fit for purpose state. It has one of the largest RE potential, 142 gigawatt of solar, some 18 odd gigawatts for wind. It has state-owned DISCOMs as well as private DISCOMs in 4 cities which are running on a franchisee model. It has thermal power plants, nuclear power plants. The success of the mega Bhadra solar plant is also a testimony to this. At the same time, it has one of the highest tariffs in the country, and the AT&C losses and ACS-ARR gaps are also towards the red line, the red mark. And Kashish mentioned in his presentation that a key reason, a potential reason for that is that it does not have in-state hydro, and that it does not have coal resources as well as it would have liked to have. And this is something that even senior bureaucrats have time and again mentioned, that our high tariffs are because of high landed cost of coal, hydro not being available to us. And therefore, these external intrinsic challenges the externalities that are beyond our control are the main reasons for the unsustainable tariff and the unsustainable power sector. But let me just give you a counterpoint. For hydro, we have Uttarakhand and Himachal Pradesh, which are very much hydro intensive. And the metrics of ACS ARR gap in both these states, in Himachal, it is very good. It is at 0.3 or 0.4 rupees per unit. But for Uttarakhand, it is again 1.6. So having hydro does not necessarily imply that the benchmarks of operational efficiency or better tariffs would be granted. We need more structural reforms and solutions in the sector that are required to do that. Similarly for coal, the story that I want to tell you is of two states, Rajasthan and Gujarat. And if you can visualize a linear chain in front of you, starting with the state generation plants, then transmission, and then distribution, finally leading to consumers. So if we take only the state generating plants that are using coal and other inputs to generate electricity, the landed cost of coal at both these states come to around 3 to 5 rupees a unit. And sorry, before proceeding, I just want to mention that why I'm talking about thermal only, starting with thermal, is because the transition to a cleaner energy future needs to also take into account the efficiency, the optimal utilization of existing resources, and then a strategized and planned approach from efficiency to circularity and then finally to sustainability is the need of the hour, especially when we are seeing disruptions like digitalization, decarbonization. Manish talked about emerging technologies. So in that context, a cleaner future also needs to take into account what the existing value chain looks like, and only then is it able to effectively pull in these emerging technologies, and then we can go in a renewable future, because an aggressive push to renewable energy will lead to thermal power plants, by the way, which are already reeling under very much severe financial and operational stress, to go even beyond their technical minimum at which they are required to run. Therefore, this transition needs to also take into account the efficiency part of it, on which I'm coming right now. Both for Rajasthan and Gujarat, if you look at landed cost, it's in the range of 3.8 to 5.5 rupees per kg. But when this gets converted into the generation, the electricity generated, the fuel price for Rajasthan is 2.98 per unit, while for Gujarat is 3.18 per unit. So effectively, Rajasthan is generating power. The state thermal plants are generating power which are 20 paisa less than at what rate the Gujarat thermal power plants are generating it. But then it passes on through the transmission network, and by the time it reaches the distribution utility periphery, the scenario becomes opposite. The 20 paisa advantage that Rajasthan enjoyed in fuel price becomes a 40 paisa loss in the power procurement cost for distribution utilities. So that means that there are nodes of inefficiencies in between, which are making this 20 paisa profit to begin with into a wider loss of 40 paisa per unit. So for Rajasthan, the power procurement cost of our distribution utilities from these plants is 3.87 per unit, while for Gujarat, it is 3.3637 a unit. And the situation becomes even worse when it goes out from the distribution periphery to the final consumers, with Rajasthan's average cost of supply going at 7.02 a unit, while for Gujarat, it is only 6.02 unit. So effectively, what we began with a profit of 20 paisa has turned into a loss of 1 rupees per unit because of the systemic inefficiencies that the sector faces. And when we talk about a cleaner energy transition and infusion of renewables into it, we need to also take into account the readability and acceptability of this only value chain to adopt to them. And the next line of analysis that we did was we tried to get into depth of what these imply, or what are the reasons behind these inefficiencies. So if I'll just take the example of the thermal power plants, the generation part of it first. We calculated the different fixed costs and energy costs that are there with a matrix of the cost to generate 1 unit of electricity. So the unit is rupees lakhs per unit. And when we see 3 main thermal power plants that are here, Kota, Suratgarh and Chhabra, the cost per unit to cost to generate per unit, they are hugely variable. The O&M is the O&M is around 30 lakhs per unit, while for depreciation, it ranges from 8 lakh for Kota to 40 lakhs per unit for Chhabra. So maybe even in desperate times calls for desperate measures. Maybe for COVID times, something on those lines could be sort of that maybe Chabra being a new power plant could be allowed to not recover accelerated depreciation, so that the power tariffs could in the end be more sustainable. Similarly, if we look at the energy cost, these three power plants are situated within a periphery of 120 kilometers. The landed price of coal for Kota is 4.08 unit, for Chabra is 3.97, which is very sustainable, while for Suratgarh it's 5.45. And all these three units are linked to the same coal mine that they are procuring it from. So maybe there are reasons that go within it for this anomaly. But similarly for gross calorific value also there is significant differences. So now coming to the main point, these systemic inefficiencies are not only in the generation part of it, but then they sort of max out at the distribution point. For instance, for Rajasthan, if we compare Rajasthan and Gujarat in terms of the distribution segment, the power purchase cost to sell 1 unit of electricity for Rajasthan is the best amongst different states. It's 5 rupees per unit. But for Gujarat, it's 5.26. But the game changes in the interest cost. So for Gujarat, the interest cost per unit electricity sales is 0.18 per unit, while for Rajasthan, it's 1.11 per unit. And these calculations are done on the basis of 2019-20 tariff order data. And this 1.11 unit is a major factor in what effectively then results in a higher tariff for the end consumers. So I have a 5-pointer food for thought to leave everybody with, especially in terms of the clean energy transition and using efficiency as the stepping stone to actually then lead to sustainability. The first one is that there have been talks about Delhi or Mumbai with private DISCOMs performing better, but a reason that is also there is of their consumer mix. So for instance, we need to have dedicated, targeted, consumer-wise interventions sought for, because each state, each consumer, each distribution circle narrates its own story, and the policy as well as regulatory method to to go to them should be a consumer specific one. And there are wide issues at the grassroots for, if we are talking about acceptability from the consumer's point of view, even for a state like Rajasthan, say in a village far away in Barmer, you won't be able to read the meter readings on some occasions because of the sand and dust and everything. So for them to then think of IoT enabled devices or smart meters, there is a need also, but firstly, those realities are to be accounted for in preparing policies or schemes. So after consumer mix, the next is this sales migration issue that we need to also encounter, because recently the Electricity Regulatory Commission put forward a draft proposal that for open access, even for renewable energy based open access, they are going to levy additional surcharge on that, which are making the solar developers also unhappy. So the only high paying good consumers, if you can call them that, are now increasingly migrating to different other alternatives of energy, which are leaving the bleeding DISCOMs in much more trouble. And a DISCOM free environment cannot be sort of, but we have to think through what the situation is in terms of open access also. The next is on the political economy front. We all the time talk about the independence of electricity regulatory commissions, but the need is to also think through that how the TAP approach, the transparency, accountability, and participatory approach could be enshrined, and different externalities are also to be taken account for having a better approach of the regulatory commission towards a cleaner energy transition, as well as solving the issues that are the pending before the sector. The next is that there are many changes or interventions that are in the pipeline, be it tariff rationalization, direct benefit transfer of subsidies, privatization of DISCOMs. Manish spoke at length about clean transportation and the need of it. So for that, we cannot do away, or we cannot just impose these changes and we need to adopt a certain kind of a pilot approach or a regulatory sandbox approach, which is prevalent in financial sector, but we need to also think through of maybe demarcating a particular area which is fit for purpose, and then pilot certain new solutions, and learn from them for before scaling them up or making them replicable or making them apply to a larger jurisdiction. For instance, just to mention one point from Manish's presentation regarding clean transportation, we also did a study on electric vehicles, and they entail a huge economic benefit for not just the power sector but the transportation sector as well. And also from our calculations, it was also found that for electric vehicles, if they come into picture, then till 2030, even 50,000 new jobs can be created in Jaipur itself. But at the same time, there's a risk of around 15,000, 16,000 jobs becoming redundant in the auto sector, which will require again reskilling, upskilling, and thinking through what the need of the hour is then. So all in all, this is I'll conclude by saying that yes, Rajasthan does present a very good picture and of opportunities as well as many uncertainties, and we need to think outside the box of only devising economic solutions, but also thinking through for the political, economic, social, environmental concerns as well. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks very much, Sarthak. And I think while Kashish and Manish gave an overview from their point of view, for somebody like you who is based in the state, getting all the inputs, and I think I picked up quite a few uh, things that you said. The most important was, let efficiency be the stepping stone to sustainability, because I think while there is a lot of discussion on how these things are beneficial for a cleaner environment, reduction in emissions, but unless you don't show actual money savings on the table or you don't show efficiency, they don't cut ice with policymakers and leave aside with the politicians. So, but also I think there were lots of things that you said otherwise on what a just transition would really mean, and actually brought the discussion literally back to, which I think we should open up after Manju has also given her opening remarks on what should the state really focus on in the next 5 or 10 years, considering as well that, in a COVID-ridden world, demand is not going to come back to normal and the situation will be a little bit different. But, you left really at that point on how sustainability goals are not just driven home by sustainability itself, and maybe there are drivers to that, and we've discussed like the technical aspects, the financial aspects, but Manju, after listening to all the the studies and the analyses that have been presented, and also from how you have been observing what is happening to large scale solar and the deployment of large scale solar, what do you think are the important criteria which are often missed in a system anyway? The importance of social needs when we are ramping up our capacities for a particular form of energy, which on one side is clean, but on the other hand can also have implications if not done well. I know as a scholar you have thought a lot about these issues, so feel free to just guide us in some direction on this one.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much for including me in the panel. I found these presentations before me really fascinating and interesting. And like a lot of people, I totally, can you guys hear me? Is it clear? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, so I find a lot of the, I completely share the optimism and hope that both Kashish and Manish spoke about. But being considering the kind of work that I do, I actually appreciate some of the points that Sarthak made, which actually are about going slow and still sort of looking at the renewable energy sector in pilot mode, though I think I think we've gone past that stage now. And so there are some big signs of worry that are already coming up from the various states where renewable energy has taken off, and projects are sort of halfway through implementation and things like that. So I'm just going to extend a few of the points that that he made, but looking at it somewhat more politically rather than technologically, as he sort of pointed out again and again. And this is not to say that these are two completely different areas and should be looked at separately, but I think the point is that we have to look at these things together, and thankfully we are in a period where there is a lot of growth in interdisciplinary work in these fields. Particularly energy transition as a topic has been written about by so many scholars and written about very well. So I'm just going to try and sort of pick up some threads from some of the wonderful scholarship that's out there. So one book that always comes to mind, which I think a lot of people here might have read, because it deals directly with the politics of development, is the work by James Scott. And his book is titled Seeing Like a State. So I think it's a very famous title. But the remaining part of the title is How Certain Schemes to Improve the Human Condition Have Failed. And the book is full of very fascinating case studies, which basically point to how technological choices are at the same time political choices, even if we can't necessarily see that right at the beginning. And so, while making these technological choices, we have to pay a great deal of attention to how they change social relations on the ground. This is both in terms of how they change relations between different social groups. And, India is a classic case study for that, because everywhere you go, you are confronted by these distinctions among social groups, and it has to be reconciled. But also in terms of the relationships between how different groups of communities use resources. So, there's no escaping these issues at all, no matter how important technological change is at this point of time. And so I hope we can actually take into account, the lessons from many of these case studies to actually get this energy transition right. But even as I say this, I have I'm sort of left feeling that we should have done this already, because we are now in the middle of that transition rather than at the beginning. One thing that a lot of scholars have written about is that, the idea of energy transition, it sounds like it is just a transition and not anything more as well. So in some ways it's kind of de-ideologized. It's kind of, the politics is sort of almost separated from it, so that one can see it merely as a technological transition rather than a social transition. But I feel that it's really important to put that back together in order to grapple with some of the bigger questions that renewable energy projects are throwing up. And this is not something that anthropologists or social scientists are saying, but somebody like Bruno Latour, for example, who is one of the greatest scholars on science and technology studies, says that we have to get the politics right before getting the technology right. So I feel that this point cannot be underestimated or understated at all. But the way I think energy transition, or particularly renewable energy projects, are being implemented in India, it looks like they are being treated as what are called technological fixes. Basically, it means that we are trying to fix a very huge problem through the introduction of a new technology, but our medium or the vehicle of introducing that new technology is still very much the very familiar state. And it's a state which largely, for most times, it kind of depends on a business as usual approach. And by businesses, I mean, we've had this phrase thrown around a lot in the last few years. By business as usual, I don't just mean how it views businesses or economic growth or growth models, but it's also about how it views the role of society in that growth. So basically the kinds of the political arithmetic is all pretty much the same. Some people win, some people lose, some people have to sacrifice for some other people's needs. This is like a political arithmetic that keeps on playing over and over again in India with respect to projects that are supposedly meant to improve our conditions. But unless that political arithmetic is paid attention to, and we try and pay attention to, to turn that around, we are going to end up being in the same sort of situation that other projects, whether it's thermal power, whether it's hydropower, whatever, are faced with. So, and specifically, I feel that the questions of, I mean, we know these questions, and I think a lot of the people who are here, in this program also have written about it, have spoken about it a lot. But I find that when it comes to renewable energy, a lot of the technical arguments sort of precede these points, and the questions of dispossession, marginalization, social inequality, I mean, they're all seen as second layer issues, which somehow have to be sort of figured out in what is already a sort of a given understanding of how this transition needs to take place. And I feel that there might be some problems over there, and it's already showing up because, I mean, as we all saw this morning's, the article that Mridula Chari has written, it's an excellent piece to show that renewable energy development in general, but she is particularly focused on Rajasthan, which is our point of discussion today, that it's the problems are also becoming more systematic, because it's not just a one-off problem occurring here and there, but we might see increasingly that more and more projects are having to confront these problems. And I'm specifically talking about large-scale projects, right? So these issues which are well known to us in terms of development are actually appearing with renewable energy transition as well. And I feel one of the lessons from that is that you can't tweak these projects or these schemes once they're already set up. If social inequality and discrimination and dispossession are actually big issues that we have to deal with, these have to be built in to how we're thinking about technological transition right from the beginning, because it cannot be brought in as a specific point later on to be resolved as the scheme unfolds and things like that. So I feel that, I mean, this question about what is the social organization of renewable energy? That's actually an important question. And this is not a new question, not even in India, because I feel very early on, 2011, 2012, 2013, people in organizations or think tanks were already talking about this, saying that the social organization of renewable energy is really important to pay attention to, because these are going to be new areas that we are looking at. So it's all greenfield projects. These are also areas which are not connected to the grid. So how do you actually sort of make them a part of these, part of this, the whole energy networks? And also in terms of, I mean, we know very little about how, livelihoods and, how people sort of use and sustain on these resources in these areas, because actually many of these areas are outside of the purview of developmental projects and schemes of governments. So, you know, what the renewable energy, what the geography of renewable energy development is showing us is that we're moving into areas which have already suffered the unevenness of development, the effects of that. And now if we want to go into those places and actually change those places, we're going to have to take into consideration what their developmental experience has been all along, and whether we can actually provide them something that's worth their taking. That's really crucial. And for that, I feel that, you know, I don't know if we can set up renewable energy to do that, because renewable energy also depends on, I mean, the competitiveness of renewable energy projects also depends on things like cheapest resources, right? So is it possible then for us to shift the way renewable energy development is taking place, depending on what kinds of geographies it is looking to be set up in? That's an important question. I feel that there's a lot to learn already from the kinds of projects that have already been set up. And it's quite clear that regulatory approvals given for these projects, or the regulatory procedures set up for these projects, have a completely different set of priorities as compared to what social legitimacy takes as important questions. So for example, you know, when a project is being given regulatory approvals, the kinds of aspects that are looked into may not necessarily be the aspects that people who live in these areas or who use these resources where renewable energy projects are supposed to be set up, their priorities may be completely different. So can we actually figure out some ways by which this gap is closed between the priorities of regulatory approvals and what communities or social groups in these areas require, which is what, I mean, I think is called social legitimacy, because you need people on your side in order to get these projects up and running. I feel another point that has definitely sort of you know, become a big question is the feasibility, I mean, is the scale of this ambition, renewable energy ambition. I don't know to what extent states or even, you know, sub-state actors or institutions feel about the idea of renewable energy targets being pushed from the top. It's not very clear whether those targets actually take into consideration or are actually based on very real and practical feasibility studies of how much is possible in different areas. So I feel like there needs to be some sort of, you know, reconciling of this target-based approach with the actual feasibility of projects in different areas. I know, I mean, we all lauded the ambitious targets when they first came, but I'm not really sure whether I'm not very sure whether it works in planning and implementing these projects in the long run. So I feel like the issues about, you know, what Mridulachari writes about the piling of court cases, I feel like it sets a very, you know, it sets a very a difficult, it sets a very a troubling sort of note for renewable energy development. And I feel like it's really important to actually bring not just people who understand the technological and financial and other advantages of renewable energy, but it's equally important to bring, you know, people who understand the social dynamics around large-scale energy projects. Yeah, so I'll stop there.
Thank you, Manju. And we have less time, but I think some of the basic issues that you brought about on, you know, conducting social feasibility are not into the infrastructure projects. And clearly, you know, 175 gigawatts by 2022 is just the beginning. If we are slated to do 450 gigawatts by 2030, and each of our states are looking at large utility, I think it's pretty crucial that the concerns of community at least are brought in, and the community is not either at best the recipient or at worst adversaries in this fight, because that is what I think it's ultimately becoming and doesn't seem like good signs. And the earlier speakers talked about techno-economic feasibility. I think it should be a techno-economic social feasibility, if anything. And unless that is not ticked, that framework, should really not be accepted. But I will pause for a moment. I know we have like 3-4 minutes. We have for a few on the panel. And some of the earlier discussions, things got left out, but there were some important things, which I think Kashish was on your slide on looking at agriculture sector and offering solar agriculture. And I think there are these issues of like longer term PPAs and how to deal with them. Manish, you had lots of forward looking on 2050, but also more of what can be done by 2030. And Sarthak, you of course brought out the 5 points. All I'm coming to is one by one, I just want to ask all of you in a rapid fire, if there are 2 or 3 things that you think can be done, considering that the next couple of years are tough as well from an economic recovery point of view, what are those 2 or 3 important things which are both possible to do and also fit into the state where we don't have too much fiscal reserves and everything has to be, more fiscally prudent in that sense. So I will go to you, Kashish, first and then follow the speaking order.
Yeah, sure. So I think, looking at the DISCOM sector and, just in general, India's electricity sector, I don't think so. There is a silver bullet and there is not one solution fits all for states. As Sarthak said, we compared Gujarat and Rajasthan. The dynamics are different. The inefficiencies are different. So I think specifically talking from Rajasthan's point of view, I think I've tried to, jot down some of the key issues which could be targeted in the near term, and solarization of agricultural demand definitely has some merits for consideration. And I think the state's already looking into it. So it is, number one, it's going to try and target the disbalance of cross subsidies in the Rajasthan's DISCOM sector, because for the 3 DISCOMs, the state-owned DISCOMs, the profile of customer, the customer profile in terms of agricultural, industrial, and residential is different. So I think in terms of solving that disbalance, I think cheaper renewable energy in terms of distributed solar through solar pump sets or in general distributed solar should be targeted. Yeah.
Got it. Manish?
Yeah, well, I kind of reflect the same thoughts. I mean, there's no one thing to tackle this massive complex problem, I would say. But I think, having spoken to a lot of the DISCOM folks myself, it's very difficult. Even the techno-economic case to sort of convince them is quite a challenge, because I think that the thinking in the DISCOMs has to change from being the old conventional way to, think about it from a more systemic perspective. And with all the changes that are happening and the rate of change that's happening, I think the DISCOMs have to really sort of speed up their own sort of thinking. And like when Manju pointed out, I mean, that it's a systemic problem, and targets are just shoved up, and then the DISCOMs have to figure out a way to just infuse this renewables in, and it's creating a lot of problems, and they're always complaining. So I think a more systemic approach to this whole thing, and how states should be involved in the planning, and even the DISCOMs having a sort of a prominent role in the planning itself would sort of help a lot. And nonetheless, I think technologies are coming, and they will start disrupting whether we like it or not. And I mean, electric vehicles are already there on the door, and And once we have a large number of them, they're going to create a lot of problems for the DISCOM. And the way the DISCOMs envision this and the way they think about this, I think is a big challenge. And that's where, as civil society, we'll have to try and help them out with as many studies and sort of infuse participation and try to help out as much as possible.
Got it. So more like a DISCOM systemic perspective and changing things for the long term. Sarthak, you had some very valid points from your work in the state. What's your shortlist?
Yeah, so resonating the same sentiment, one size fits all can't be the way forward. But if I had to just quickly list down 3 things that we can consider as of now, I'd again go with efficiency in the existing system as the stepping stone. And states already are aware of what needs to be done to increase efficiency of the current power sector. It's not something that we need to hand out on a piece of paper. But simultaneously, with efficiency, when we are looking at sustainability, I like that word, techno-economic and social inclusion of social in that framework. So for up and coming technologies, the processes starting from planning to monitoring, evaluation, implementation, cross learnings, etc. There should be an institutionalized practice to look at sustainability in a way which is just and which is beneficial for the largest stakeholders at large. And finally, capacity building exercises for the state, because when our finance minister says or the economic service says that behavioral economics is something which we need to incorporate into our governance as well, and then there's a significance to actually thinking of the problem in a way in which the addressee is also capacitated enough to go forward for it. Yeah.
Got it.
I'll stop
Manju, you will have the last word.
The last word is that I don't really know what can be done, but I feel like, I think the most important thing for me is to not look at renewable energy like it's a technical issue. And I hope having, I don't know how much scope there is to assess many of these projects before they are sort of, given full shape and put on the implementation path. But I think there's a lot of space to actually look at projects that are already ongoing and which have been implemented, and to study them well and try and learn from those projects about what might be wanting in the way we are approaching the question of energy transition. I'm not sure that's saying much, but I just feel it'll be useful to have a lot more detailed research and studies on what has happened so far with respect to renewable energy projects and how they've been implemented. And I think there are some good studies coming out for sure, which is very useful.
Got it. And I think, that makes sense. We've stressed enough on this program today on the need to have the social costs of renewables as much as we talk about the social costs of coal power. We will wind up at this moment. A few very important, inferences came out. The biggest one, that the state really does not need to rely so much on coal capacity. How much faster and how much quicker it can do that is the question. It certainly needs to do a lot more renewables, but the flavor of those renewables, the more decentralized and small scale and community it is, the more long-term the results will be. And, everything that each of the panelists said was pretty crucial. We will try and put this in some kind of notes and share with you all at the end. But I'm really sorry that we could not open for any of the questions from any of the journalists. But if you have any questions, feel free to write to us or to any one of the speakers, and go ahead from there. Thanks very much. Sorry for extending by 5 or 6 minutes, and have a good day. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye, Gayatri.